will be our moderator. So we're really excited for today's webinar, and we hope that you can walk away from this presentation with some tips that you can take back to your job. But before we get started, I'm just going to go over a couple of housekeeping items. So right now, you've probably noticed that everyone is on mute. That's just to avoid background noises that may distract you from listening to the webinar. So we, of course, however, do want to encourage active participation. If you have a question, just type it into the question box at the bottom right-hand side of your webinar screen. We will monitor the questions as they come in, and we'll answer as many of them as possible at the end of the webinar. We'll also be live tweeting throughout the webinar, so you feel free to join in on the conversation online by following us at Analyst 8. I also want to introduce our speakers. So we actually have two speakers for you today, Christina and Sean. So Christina is a managing consultant and has over 10 years of experience in the world of business intelligence. She is passionate about working with her customers, understanding their needs, and guiding them to an optimized BI solution. Outside of work, Christina enjoys traveling and exploring the outdoors, including hiking in the mountains of North Carolina, where she lives. We also have Sean. Sean is a senior consultant here at Analyst 8. He is a certified Looker data analyst and specializes in delivering sophisticated business intelligence solutions, enabling clients to make better, faster business decisions. In his free time, Sean enjoys working on cars, watching the Green Bay Packers, and exploring the local restaurants and pubs of Chicago. So with that, I will go ahead and turn the presentation over to Christina.
Thanks, Tracy. Hey everyone, thanks for joining. So just to start off, tell you a little bit about Analytics 8. We are a data and analytics consulting firm, and data and analytics is all we do. So it's not just a practice that's a small part of our company, it's our only focus. Our goal is to always enable our customers to make smart, data-driven decisions by translating their data into meaningful and actionable information. We believe that if you want to succeed in business, you need smarter insights guiding your decision-making. Those insights are available in your data. You just need the tools and techniques to expose it and the best practices and methodology to do it right. All right, so today's webinar, we'll be talking about 7 tips for strong data infrastructure. So for your analytics solution to effectively drive decision-making, you need clean data and a flexible data infrastructure that supports all of your current and future analytic needs. Everything you want to do when it comes to analytics, from the advanced stuff, data science, machine learning, to the basics, hinge on solid data infrastructure that can be successfully implemented only when you have an actionable strategy defined. In this webinar, we will go over the 7 tips that will help ensure your data infrastructure supports these objectives. This is not an exhaustive list, so it's just the 7 of the tips that we've seen help our clients in the past. And it's also not meant to be a sequential process. So these are just 7 of the most helpful tips that we thought would be useful to go over in this webinar. We hope that you leave this webinar with some ideas that you can start taking action on today and or spark further discussions on how this can be integrated into your current plans. So tip number 1 is start from the beginning. Before you embark on any data and analytics effort, you're going to want to start from the beginning and get back to why you're embarking on that effort in the first place. What is driving the need for this engagement at all? Before you tackle any kind of BI project, you need to think about your overall data and analytics strategy. Do you have one? Maybe you have the start of one, maybe you don't have one at all. If you have one, check in and figure out if it's actively implemented and adhered to. If not, it might be time to revisit it and ensure it's still relevant and closely tied to business values. Make sure you're considering questions like, what is your company's overall corporate strategy? What are the business reasons behind the need for analytics? These reasons, you're going to want them to go beyond just simply wanting the newest offering on the market. Data and analytics strategy acts as a foundation to your analytics program. It will help you establish a strategy and prioritize your projects to ensure you're on a path to achieve your long-term goals, but also allow you to take down some of those quick wins first. So we've summarized our approach to creating and implementing a data analytics strategy into 4 areas. First off, understanding future vision. Again, really want to emphasize the point. You want to make sure that your data strategy initiative is driven by your company's business goals. So start with the big picture company goals and objectives in mind, and then fill in the details of your ideal future state as you learn or consolidate the needs of the organization across the organization. So you can start with the big picture stuff and then kind of fill them in and revisit the future vision as you're going through this process. Second big point is capturing and understanding your current state. So everything from business use cases to technical challenges, technologies used, source systems used across the organization, really dig into your current systems and processes and evaluate what you're doing well and what gaps might exist. 3, develop that analytics plan. So now we know where you're starting and we know where you want to go. So let's map out the plan to get from A to B. Here you're going to be designing that ideal solution, and then the architecture, the staffing, the timeline, et cetera, that you're going to need to get there. And then finally, what's the point in coming up with a plan if you're not going to implement it? So delivering results. The key here is to plan for delivery in short phases. So don't boil the ocean. In this way, you'll see tangible results with each iteration. And at the same time, you're moving towards that long-term strategic goal that you set out for yourself. And it's important to kind of keep that in mind as you're going through the previous steps, because as you're doing step 2, capturing the current state, you'll be meeting with business users and you're going to start communicating this plan across your organization. Folks are probably going to be getting excited about it. So it's good to kind of set expectations that while you're planning for the big picture, and capturing your current state, future state, and developing that plan, it's actually going to be implemented in iterations. So they don't expect it all to be available at once, but more of like a living process where we can continue to expand and enhance and adapt to the constantly changing environment and challenges and requirements. So part of understanding your current state, you can use a maturity model like this one. You may have seen similar ones on Gartner. This is just a model that we came up with to help our customers kind of understand where they lie on the overall maturity model spectrum. So this can be helpful. A lot of our customers kind of, when we share this, it's helpful that a lot of times you can immediately identify kind of where you are on the spectrum. And that's comforting in a way, because other people have been there. We've seen people at various stages in here. And even more important than understanding where your company falls within the maturity model is understanding what that next state is that you're going to be striving to achieve. So it's going to help you kind of define what your goals are. And the other nice thing about this is, you're going to move from step to step. You don't need to jump from, one of the first 2 phases to the last one. You'll move up this spectrum as your company grows and changes. You'll find points where the current state you're in this maturity model will no longer successfully support your needs or allow for future growth. So that'll naturally then spark the drive to move to the next state in this maturity model. And the overall goal here is for your company to become analytically mature and have a data-driven culture, one where everyone throughout the organization is using data to make decisions. There are a lot of layers to a strategy, and most likely you're going to need more than one tool to implement a complete solution. So this is a visual we came up with to help our customers understand all of the layers that are involved with a data analytics solution. It can also be particularly useful if you're trying to explain to business users or executives why there's not that magic button solution or why it takes longer than they might expect to onboard a new data source or capability. And when you're looking at this, just note, obviously you might not need all the boxes at your company, but most likely you're going to need one box in each layer and possibly multiple in the analytics layer. So you'll want to make sure that the technologies you're selecting or planning on adding to your solution to support each of the needs in these layers are also compatible with each other. And don't get caught up in the hype. Don't just select a technology stack because it's the newest technology with the most buzz. Choose a tool that will efficiently address the needs of and fit into your company's unique landscape and support business goals. All right, so this first tip was all about defining your data and analytics strategy. So how can you get started doing that? What can you start doing today? I mean, first of all, if you don't have a well-defined strategy, you need to start developing one. Consulting firms can help guide you through this process if you need help from someone who's done it before to get you started on the right track. But whether you get help or not, there's things that you can start doing now to help start preparing and planning for your own data and analytics strategy. So this slide is obviously not everything you would do to start the processes that we described in the previous few slides. But here's 2 pieces that are pretty approachable and that you could actually start investigating now. And regardless of what path you go forward, these will be useful things to have documented and help you kind of make progress along that path. So the first one is start talking to the business and gathering requirements. Again, we always want our approach to be driven by company goals, business value. So it's a great place to start. You, as part of this process too, might be understanding if any initiatives like this have taken place already, because you always want to be respectful of the business user's time. So first ask around, find out if there's been any initiatives, if there's any requirements already documented, make sure you're up to speed on those first, and then start talking to the business users to fill in any gaps in existing documentation. And a nice little tip for this one is instead of just asking what they need, also ask them to show you. If you are working with a business user who, for example, has only used Excel, they might not even know what to ask for or what's available or what could be possible. So by asking them to show you how they use data in their day-to-day business processes, that will give you an idea of what we could do to better support them in those endeavors. And then, of course, document those findings. Those will be, your leverage for justifying the need for a data analytics strategy or any of the pieces, in a future architecture diagram that you might want to implement, and also to have all of the good information that you've collected documented for future reference. And then the second tip here is start making a list of source systems. So again, check first if you already have this at your organization, but you'd be surprised how many times we find that just even a simple consolidated list of source systems used across the organization doesn't exist to start with. And it's a great place to start with because it'll help you start understanding basically what the scope of data is at your company. It often even raises insights that you didn't know before, like the fact that, one department is using a data source that nobody else knows about, or, two departments are sharing a data source that they didn't realize there were any other dependencies on. So even just a simple thing like making this list can get you started with understanding your current landscape. All right, and for tip 2, I'll pass it over to Sean.
Thanks, Christina. I'm Sean. I'm going to talk about project prioritization. So I'll start with just a little background on kind of why do we want to, prioritize our projects. Obviously, in most organizations, you're almost always going to have a limited number of resources, whether that be time or money. So you need to kind of prioritize on what you're going to work on first, right? Because you want to deliver those high-value, quick wins first. That's going to help drive user adoption. And as Christine mentioned a little earlier, if you try to boil the ocean and build everything in one go, only to deliver it a year later, the project is ultimately going to fail because business users, for one, aren't going to wait that long. And 2, the requirements or the data sources will almost certainly have changed in that time period. And then also by building things, incrementally and in smaller projects, you can periodically, course correct and tailor your solution as you're getting input from the user. And so with that, prioritization is more of a process and not a one-time activity. And with that, as we have here on the slide, I think it should be emphasized that the prioritization needs to be well communicated because everyone on the team should know what the agreed upon priorities are. And this communication helps clear doubts and manage expectations. It lets business users know that you hear them, you understand their pain points, and you're going to get to their data analytics needs eventually. But as an organization, you decided that there's just other needs that are more critical to the business. So with that, how we get started on prioritizing your projects is through prioritization matrix. So this ultimately will help you assess, current state of your analytics practices, prioritize efforts, and build a long-term plan. And how you start to build this out is, you talk with business, you gather all your requirements, you look at maybe your KPIs or the different analytical areas that you're trying to build. Each one a number, 1 through 10 for business value, and then also 1 through 10 on technical feasibility. And these values are relative to each other, right? So you're only going to consider projects or matrix that are important and you get done eventually. So to help get some of these inputs, you wanted to talk to people from all levels of the organization, right? So somebody closer to the operations side might have a better understanding on how technically feasible something is, whether you actually have that data or the nature of that source system or how that data is structured. But then, somebody maybe on that same operations team may not see the business value of bringing in, 10 years of historical data. But then when you talk to somebody on the exec team, they're planning a potential IPO or maybe a private equity investment where they're going to need to have that data in there. So you really need to talk to people throughout the organization to kind of get these values correct. So then once you do that, you're going to look at those projects. Ideally in the upper right-hand corner there, those are the dots in blue. And that's going to be your kind of low-hanging fruit, your quick wins that you kind of want to go after first. And that's going to hopefully give you something, or give your users something they could tackle right away that's going to bring them a lot of value. And then so as you build this out, you just need to revisit the matrix periodically because as you build out the solution, then the technical feasibility for the projects that you've already identified may start to change. And then also new projects may come into the mix. So with that, I'm going to pass it back over to Christina.
Thanks. All right, so tip 3, evaluate your environments. So as we saw on the technology rainbow slide, that layered onion slide, there's lots of pieces to a data analytics solution. And each layer should be periodically revisited to make sure it's still the best choice and appropriately configured to support the constantly changing and growing business needs. So here's some examples of areas you might want to start documenting as you're evaluating your existing environment. So security considerations, some of the things you might want to think about there are the right people able to access the right information, or is security over restrictive? Are there appropriate processes in place to add access for new users and decommission users who are no longer part of the company? Data load and storage strategy. So on the data load side, start finding out, documenting, do you have SLAs defined for when data should be ready at the start of each day? Make sure you've reached out to the business and found out, if they're waiting till noon for some critical information, that might be something that gets put on the roadmap as something that needs to be addressed pretty quickly. And then if you have SLAs, are you hitting these goals consistently? This will help you identify if there's a performance concern. Storage, something to consider there. Do you have a historic data retention policy defined? Are there archive procedures in place? Architecture diagrams, they can be helpful to visualize all the components and interdependencies in your solution. And then also check in on the change management strategy. Is that process defined and well agreed upon within your organization? So some things you can get started with as you're evaluating your environments. Look for redundancies in your system. That could be a quick win if you find some redundancies that can be eliminated. Evaluating your environment, and if a cloud solution might be favorable to an on-prem solution, this could enable your environment to scale up easily as the company grows. So if you're not already on the cloud, might be a good chance to revisit that and see if it's something that'll help enable you to be more agile in the future. Consider your, if you have multiple environments or if you need them. So at the very least, we really recommend that you have a dev and a production environment. That would be best practice. More environments like dev, QA, dev, test, QA, prod are also common for larger companies or areas where there's a lot of development, but more than 2 environments might be overkill depending on the size of your company, and it might just be more red tape and more time to delivery that could be sped up. So just some things to consider there. And then also, if you have a dev solution, consider at least document what is the refresh strategy on that. Often your production environment is common for that to be refreshed more frequently than your dev environment, but make sure it's at least a strategy that's, again, documented and agreed upon within your organization so that your developers are not having to do a lot of rework as they find out things about their development work once it's moved to production that they could have easily seen if the dev environment was a little bit more up to date. So dev does not necessarily, oh yeah, so that's it for this tip. Move on to tip 4, back to Sean.
All right, so first I'll talk kind of a little bit about what data model is before Ian talks about how you want to build one. So your data model is the physical table structure that your data lives in, and it's going to determine how your data can be used and ultimately the story that data will tell. And your data model is going to organize your data such that it's optimized for data out, which is analysis, and not data in like you would have in a transactional system. And with your data model, you want to be flexible, you want to be robust, you want to support multiple use cases, while at the same time remain performant under heavy loads. And just as a disclaimer, so when we're talking about data models here, we're talking about how you're structuring your structured data, but you may have unstructured data out there where you'd have a data lake, and sometimes things that you might have like schema on read, but so this would be more focused on how you organize your structured data. So for the next slide, talking about our relational data model and how it relates to a data warehouse and why you need one. So data warehouse, essentially pulls everything together, so there's no need to access like disparate data sources separately. It cuts down on a ton of data prep that people may be, manually doing, pulling different reports out of different source systems and trying to marry them up together. And then, by the time those reports are developed, they're already out of date. The data warehouse pulls all together automatically, so it's always up to date. And by integrating these separate data sources along a common attribute, you now have like a single data source, and that single source is the truth. And additionally, a lot of source systems may have, weird data structures or column names in their databases, and those can be, kind of hard to work with. So your data warehouse, you want it to be understood by a human. So you want your column name to be, verbose, and you want things to exist, at a granularity that mimics the business process. And then additionally, your data warehouse is going to, reduce the time that you need to analyze your data. You'll be able to access it quickly. It's going to give you confidence in your data, and you might start to get some insights that you would not have been able to get before. And then also too, your data warehouse, the sources are going to be governed, and it kind of prevents this what I call Wild West data analysis, where everyone's bringing their own sources and they're doing their own thing, and you don't really know how vetted all that is. So then when you talk about data warehouse and data model, how it pertains to your modern tools like Click, Tableau, and Power BI, those on top of your data model is going to allow users to have self-service, together some great visualization, and some of these tools you can just bring data in, and they will work if you don't really build a solid data model that's designed for analytics. But, with a good data model and like one of these modern BI tools, it's business support use cases and analysis that you never even planned for when you designed it. And you'll see users coming up with this stuff and putting together these great dashboards and reports that you had no idea was even possible. But then if you have, a bad data model or one that isn't very designed well, it's going to continually manifest itself in these tools in the form of poor performance or ultimately frustrating user experience. So if you want to get started on building a data model, one thing we like to do is build bus matrix. So what this does is it has all the business processes that you're trying to model. And then with that, you have all your common dimensions on how you're going to slice and dice the data. So it kind of provides like, a top-down strategic perspective on everything that you're looking to integrate into your data warehouse and BI environment. But then it can also support, bottom-up delivery in the sense of looking at one of these business processes and then focusing on one at a time to build out. And then over time, more and more of this bus matrix will be in your data warehouse. And then also with this, you kind of have a full view of your enterprise. When you're building things out, you're planning for the future. You're building your data model with the whole enterprise in mind, and then not just the one little business process that you're working on at the current time. So for our next tip, we'll talk a little bit about documenting your data lineage. All right, so as the slide says, it's boring, but it's necessary, and that's pretty true. You do need to document your data as it goes from, its origin to its destination. You need to know where this data is coming from and any transformations or anything along the way that got it to where it was. And by having this knowledge, users are going to start to trust and understand where this data is coming from. So, by documenting all this stuff too, it tells people, what data is available, how it's intended to be used, any like business definitions you might have in there. And importantly too, it kind of gets the knowledge out of the head of the ETL developer. A lot of times they may know where all your data comes from and, this column is transformed this way, or this thing's pulling from this source. But nobody else really has that information. So by documenting your data lineage, it gives that knowledge to everyone else. And then, it just provides just greater transparency to what is going on. And if there are, maybe data mapping errors or things like that, then it will allow you to get in front of those a lot more quickly. And then also provides a method to do impact analysis. So if there is a change in one of your data sources, then you can look at this document and see, what downstream tables might be impacted by that. So a tip for getting started with your documentation is building what we like to call an ETL mapping document. Some people might call it source to target. And it's essentially like a visual of your existing data flow and the lineage. So, you might have all your destination columns in your data warehouse. And then you have also what sources those are coming from, your data types, your transformation, and then maybe any business definitions that you have. And, this also helps you track of metrics, right? Because, revenue may be something in 3 different places. So this is a way you're going to say, hey, here's exactly how, revenue is being calculated. And then, a tip with doing this is you really want to build this document as you're developing. Some large organizations may have dedicated documentation teams, or maybe you'll get lucky and have somebody on your team who's kind of a documentation enthusiast. But most times, the developer who's doing the ETL is going to be one doing the documentation. So it saves so much time to build this out while you're doing your development, because if you don't, you're going to have to go back into all your code and kind of retrace all those steps, and it'll take 3 times as long to build a document compared if you just did it side by side. So that's back over to Christina.
Thanks, Sean. All right, on to tip assess performance. So when you're considering performance, you'll want to look at both the front-end user experience and the back-end performance. On the user experience side, you'll want to start documenting current runtimes versus user expectations. You'll want to keep in mind, especially with the user experience, there's multiple factors which can affect front-end performance. And actually, even to clarify that further, not just the performance of the front end, but the perceived performance of the front end can be a pretty impactful difference when you're talking about user experience. And that being said, there's a lot of variables that can affect that, which means that there can be a lot of potential bottlenecks that you'll want to start ruling out as you're evaluating that. But like I said, the first step for this would be to document what the existing user experience is. So how long a report's taking to run, and also documenting what the ideal runtime or expectations of the users are, so you can get a baseline there. And then on the back end side, you're going to want to revisit the business requirements for your source system, business requirements and source system limitations for refresh frequency. So, if you're refreshing the data very frequently right now, make sure that there is a clear business need for that, because that could be one of the simplest things that you reduce to improve performance, or a quick win, perhaps. If you're having performance issues, there might be other underlying things that you'll want to visit. But if, for example, your source system is only providing updates every day and you're refreshing the data in your data warehouse or your business intelligence solution more frequently than that, then that might be unneeded, because the data won't be anything updated from the source system and things like that. So other factors on the back end side, are you using incremental loads? Definitely want to consider those if you're not and you're experiencing long run times on back end performance. Look for opportunities to streamline your data set. So this could include, like we mentioned before, setting a retention policy. You might not need to keep all of history, or maybe after a certain point, you're only doing analysis on the most recent 2 to 5 years. The rest of the data you can archive, in a cheaper storage solution, and also not worry about keeping all of that extra history information optimized for reporting, which could really speed up your both back end and front end experience potentially. And as always, ensure that there's a business use case for the content being maintained, and that the content that all the data you're storing is actually being used. If ETL performance is an issue, look for optimizations in the way that the data is processed. So then you can kind of get into the details of fine-tuning. For example, if your ETL is being done in SSIS, fine-tuning the way, the methods that you're using in there to process the data. And some other tips here. So a great tip is to automate the back-end performance metrics and look for performance degradation before it starts affecting the front end. So a lot of times you can extract metadata from these systems. So you could go ahead and set up reports that help you keep an eye on your performance metrics. And like I said, keep an eye on it and notice when the performance starts to dip, so you can be proactive about it. Keep logs of your ETL performance and periodically check them. And then if there are issues, revisit your architecture requirements. Use cases and data change over time. So a solution that was originally designed and may have worked great in the past, might not be up for the challenges of today. So for example, you may have, for both the front end and back end side, you may have implemented a specific BI tool in the past, and over time that tool has been misused. So some tools are designed to be very good at specific things, and there are cases where you can use it to do other things, but the question is, really, should you be using it to do those other things? So for example, like some of the more modern BI tools, they are really great at analytics, but shouldn't really be used for those data dump type reports or more operational style reports. So part of your performance evaluation, it's okay for it to include pushing back and questioning things. In fact, it should include that. So, not just can we throw more resources at an issue to fix the performance issue, but are we using the right tool in the first place? Are we using the right technology in the first place? What is the business value that this particular issue, if resolved, would provide? And is that even worth tackling, or should it be approached in a different way? So don't be afraid to think outside the box when you're evaluating performance and finding solutions to those performance needs. All right, so how can you get started? Again, just start evaluating and documenting the current state. So evaluating, documenting the front-end user experience. A lot of tools these days have metadata available that you can extract. So you can use that, or you can set up various tests and polls across your organization to understand what the current runtimes are and current experience is like. Document those, use those as your baseline for improvements, and also use those documented issues as a baseline or a foundation that you can use then to prioritize those issues and decide which ones should be addressed first, which ones should be addressed at all, et cetera. And then same thing with the back end. Document what the performance is today, establish SLAs with the business, and identify areas for improvement. Okay, next up we've got our final tip, tip 7, implement a data governance program. So data governance means a lot of things and covers a lot of areas. Sean already touched on part of data governance earlier in this presentation, both on the data lineage side, which is part of data governance, and also when he was talking about the bus matrix, that even things like that overlap with data governance because they enable us to outline what the capabilities are of our BI solutions. And from that list, we can even go a step further and start identifying ownership of those. So data governance can help you formalize things that you're already doing and enable you to do it better. So with properly implemented data governance, you can gain consistency, faster time to delivery, lower maintenance needs, better quality data, better BI adoption, and a whole lot more. I mean, you've probably heard people talk about this before. It's a really critical piece of your BI solution and often neglected. So like I keep mentioning, there's a lot here. It could be a whole separate presentation, and in fact it is. So I'll hit some of the highlights here, but we have actually given a complete presentation just about data governance. So if you go to our website, you can find that previous webinar where we go into even more detail on all the points you see here. But like I said, just want to give you a couple of highlights here that you can start integrating into as you plan for your data and analytics strategy. So how to get started with a data governance program. You'll see eight steps to roll out a data governance strategy on this slide. But I think some key things here are, one, a grassroots data governance movement will not work. So for data governance to be successful, it's going to really need buy-in from leadership at the top, and it's going to need a champion at a high level in organization to support its continued enforcement. And that's why the grassroots movements tend to fail, because without that higher level support, there's nobody to enforce it. So you can set up all the guidelines and processes you want, but if people aren't following them or aren't motivated to follow them, then they're not going to provide the benefits that they could be. So to get started, well, you can see there's 8 steps here. You can get started with the first step, which is scope and initiation. And the first thing to do there is identify who will be leading the way and championing the data governance program. So all the 8 of these steps are listed in more detail on our website, and I encourage you to take a look and start outlining your own strategy. All right, so we've laid out the 7 tips. We really hope that there's something that you can take back to your organization and start implementing right away. hopefully, now you're realizing, or maybe you already knew, that you really want to do this at your organization. And therefore you might be thinking, what can I do to get next? What can I do next to get started? And we found that with our customers, often the next step could be an assessment. So I'll turn it back over to Sean, tell you a little bit about what an assessment could be.
Yeah, so an analyst assessment is where we come on site, and essentially, as like Christina mentioned, I think all the way in tip one, where you kind of go in and trying to figure out that current state and then that ideal future state, and then do that kind of gap analysis to build that roadmap. So it kind of starts off with a kickoff meeting. We come on site with all the major stakeholders, kind of identify the objectives of the assessment, maybe some of the high level corporate goals, where you want to be, identify some of the key stakeholders, high level stuff on whatever all your source systems, things to know. Then there's a series of on-site visits with a lot of interviews with stakeholders where we try to really understand all the pain points, how your analytical systems are being used today, and speaking with people from all levels of the organization, and then documenting all that, going through all those notes, putting all the puzzle pieces together to really evaluate what that current state is, and then finally put that together in some documentation. Usually it's a pretty long a Word document that goes into everything in the findings and detail, any issues they may need to look out for, higher level architecture they might want to implement, and then a presentation of all those findings. And then finally, if you wanted to move forward with actually implementing this, then some estimate. So Christina's going to go into a little more detail on kind of some of those outputs that you would get from an assessment.
Thanks, Sean. Yep, so here's just one recent example of how an assessment has helped one of our customers get started. So we followed the process that we've discussed in this presentation earlier. So we helped this customer identify their ideal future state. We evaluated the current state and mapped out a plan to move forward. But what I really wanted to kind of focus on is, so if you're thinking about doing your own assessment, what are the outputs of the assessment? So as in this example, the outputs include various artifacts. We don't just document what was evaluated, but also actually designing out the future solution, the instructions for the actually implementing that first phase of development. So the outputs themselves could include a roadmap and timeline, the conceptual model and bus matrix that Sean talked about in earlier slides. An architecture diagram is a great way to really visualize what the future state is and the changes from the current to future state. So yeah, and so those are the outputs that you can consider, start considering as you build out a strategy for your own organization as well. And I know we're running a little bit over on time here, so with that, I'll go ahead and move over to the questions slide. I think we had a couple questions that we could just wrap up with real quickly. So one question that we got, which I think was a great question, is where does big data fit in to everything we've been talking about? Because we spent a little bit of time there talking about data warehouses and why they're beneficial. So I think that's a great question, and Sean, feel free to jump in as well. But one point I wanted to make there is data warehouse can be a great solution. We found it to be a great solution for a lot of our customers. It doesn't have to be, it's not the end all be all, it doesn't have to be the only solution. But even if you have big data, we found that data warehouses can be beneficial. So big data often become just another source that can be fed into your data warehouse, because our data warehouse is really optimized for the analytics and reporting. And all those great insights that you're getting from your big data platforms and the analysis that's happening there, those are all just additional pieces of data that then need to be reported on in some way. And that's why it actually works really nicely if you can kind of just feed them the outputs of your big data solution into a data warehouse. And that being said, not just big data, but also advanced analytics and predictive. A robot, for example, to churn through some and create some awesome predictions, like all the outputs of your predictions and machine learning algorithms. The output of that is more data that you're going to want to track over time and report on and integrate with the other great sources of data that you already have in your data warehouse.
Yeah, and one thing with that, one of the many big data technologies, maybe you have, like the Hadoop technology stack, where you don't need to define, a rigid data structure up front. You can actually, define the schema on read as you're pulling out the data. If you have, some SQL on Hadoop technology. But with that, building the data model and thinking about the data warehouse, that's still a very good way to kind of define how you want to analyze and look at that data and how it models your business process. So it still provides a good framework, even if you technically don't need to build one. And, some of these big data, like analytical warehouses, like your Redshifts and your Snowflakes, you could just, easily pipe all your data in there. But, part of the idea of the data warehouse, and, it can store all the data, it'll be there just fine. The part of the data warehouse is kind of that integrating system, so they're one-to-one, so you get that end-to-end view of your business. If you just kind of throw all that data in there and not make no attempt to kind of model it, then you're not really adding much value. Like you could have it all in one giant database based on big data technology like your Redshift, but you can't really do any analysis across those systems. So you really get a lot more value by taking, more data warehousing approach. Even the technology will just let you throw everything in there and one go.
Great, thanks, John. I think we have time for one more quick question, and this one, if you want, just hand it back to you, Sean. On your prioritization matrix slide, how do you assign the ratings? Is it a fixed scale when you're just, deciding the feasibility versus value ratings?
Yeah, so with the prioritization matrix, usually is a fixed scale from 1 to 10 for both, and it is relative to each other, right? Because if you ask everyone who is championing for a particular project, to them everything is going to be very high. It's going to be a 9 or a 10, and nobody would really identify their project as necessarily lower priority. So that's why they're just relative to each other on a scale from 1 to 10. And same thing with technical feasibility. If you have everything in Excel and you don't even have any kind of database technology or anything like that, then everything might be a little bit more technically challenging. But then once you have that first project set up, you have the data warehouse set up, you have the ETL tools in place, you maybe have a modular framework, then now all those other projects start to become a lot easier to implement. And then now that new technical feasibility might be more nuances between the different systems and what might make them more feasible to deliver.
Awesome. Well, I don't see any more questions in the panelists or in the panel. So Tracy, I'll pass it back to you.
Great. So just a couple of closing remarks here. So first of all, thanks again, everyone, for joining today and taking the time out of your afternoon to hop on this webinar, and also thanks so much to Christina and Sean for presenting today. So a couple people did ask, are we sending out slides? Do we record this? So yes, we did record this webinar. I will send out an email afterwards that contains a link to this recording plus a couple other relevant resources that you might find useful. So with that, I'll go ahead and conclude our webinar, and thanks again for joining. Hope you all have a great day. Bye.